scene script. Ever wondered about the origins of Brazil? The story of Brazil begins long before the arrival of the first Europeans. Thousands of years prior, the land was inhabited by a myriad of indigenous tribes. These tribes were the original custodians of the vibrant rainforests, expansive wetlands, and breathtaking highlands that make up modern-day Brazil. Each tribe was unique, boasting its own distinctive culture, language, and way of life. Some tribes were nomadic, wandering the vast landscapes in search of food and resources. Others settled along the banks of the mighty Amazon River, building intricate villages and developing agricultural practices that would sustain their communities for generations. These tribes were not isolated entities, but rather, they formed a complex network of interconnected societies, trading goods, sharing knowledge, and occasionally engaging in warfare. The indigenous peoples of Brazil were not just survivors but innovators and caretakers of their environment. They cultivated the land, harvesting crops like cassava and corn, and utilized the abundant resources around them to create tools, weapons, and beautiful handicrafts. Their spiritual beliefs were deeply intertwined with nature, fostering a profound respect for the environment and its creatures. Language was another significant aspect of these indigenous cultures. It's estimated that at the time of European contact, there were over 1,000 different languages spoken among the various tribes. These languages were as diverse as the tribes themselves, each carrying its own set of sounds, grammar rules, and vocabulary. Despite the challenges presented by their environment, these indigenous tribes thrived in Brazil for thousands of years. They formed complex societies, developed sophisticated agricultural practices, and nurtured a deep spiritual connection with the land. Their legacy is woven into the very fabric of Brazil, influencing its culture, its people, and its identity. But the tranquility of these indigenous tribes was disrupted with the arrival of the Europeans. In the year 1500, a Portuguese explorer changed the course of Brazil's history. His name was Pedro Álvares Cabral, and he was an adventurer who sailed the seas in search of new lands and wealth. He set out on a journey that would take him far from his homeland of Portugal and into the heart of the unknown. Today, he's recognized as the first European to set foot in Brazil. Cabral's arrival was marked by curiosity and caution. The indigenous tribes of Brazil had never seen anything like these strange men from across the ocean. The Portuguese, on the other hand, were fascinated by the exotic new world they had stumbled upon. The land was lush, the climate was warm, and the indigenous people were unlike any they had ever encountered. Initial interactions between the Portuguese and the indigenous tribes were largely peaceful. The Portuguese were intrigued by the tribes' way of life, while the tribes were equally curious about these foreign invaders. A complex relationship began to form, one that was marked by both cooperation and conflict. In time, the Portuguese established the first European settlement in Brazil. This was no small feat, as the land was vast and largely unexplored. But with determination and a sense of adventure, they persevered. They built homes, planted crops, and slowly began to transform the landscape. The beginning of the Portuguese colonization was a pivotal moment in Brazil's history. It marked the start of a new era, one in which the Portuguese would play a significant role. They brought with them their language, their culture, and their religion. They introduced new farming techniques and architectural styles. They also brought with them a hunger for wealth and power. But the Portuguese didn't just change Brazil, Brazil changed them too. They adapted to the new environment, adopted elements of indigenous culture, and over time a unique Brazilian identity began to emerge. And thus, the roots of Portuguese influence in Brazil were firmly planted. Over the centuries, this influence would grow and evolve, shaping the Brazil we know today. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's pause and reflect on the momentous journey that brought the Portuguese to this fascinating land. The 16th century marked the beginning of a new era for Brazil. With the arrival of the Portuguese, Brazil was thrust into the throes of colonialization. The Portuguese, driven by the allure of wealth and opportunity, began to exploit Brazil's abundant resources. One of the main economic pillars of colonial Brazil was the sugarcane industry. The Portuguese introduced large-scale sugarcane farming to Brazil, capitalizing on the country's fertile soil and tropical climate. These vast plantations, or engenhos, became the lifeblood of the Brazilian economy. But the sugarcane industry was labor-intensive, and the Portuguese settlers were vastly outnumbered by the indigenous population. To meet this demand for labor, the Portuguese turned to the transatlantic slave trade, importing vast numbers of African slaves to work the sugarcane fields. This marked the beginning of a dark chapter in Brazil's history, one that would leave an indelible mark on the nation's identity. In the 18th century, another economic boom hit Brazil, the gold rush. Gold was discovered in the inland regions of Minas Gerais, sparking a rush of settlers and slaves alike. This gold rush resulted in a significant shift in Brazil's population as people flocked from the coastal regions to the gold-rich highlands. Under Portuguese rule, Brazil's social and cultural landscape also began to transform. The Portuguese brought with them their language, religion, and customs, which began to blend with the indigenous and African cultures already present. This fusion of cultures gave rise to a unique Brazilian identity, characterized by a rich tapestry of languages, religions, and traditions. However, the legacy of slavery and exploitation cast a long shadow over Brazil. The social hierarchy established during the colonial period, with Europeans at the top and Africans and indigenous people at the bottom, created deep-seated inequalities that would persist long after the end of Portuguese rule. Over time, Brazil evolved into a melting pot of cultures, forever shaped by its colonial past. Despite the hardships and injustices of the colonial era, Brazil emerged as a nation rich in diversity and cultural heritage, a testament to its enduring spirit. In the early 19th century, winds of change began to blow in Brazil. With the arrival of the Portuguese royal family in the early 1800s, Brazil's status was elevated from a colony to a kingdom. This shift in turn sparked a transformation in the Brazilian society, fostering a sense of self-worth and an ever-growing desire for independence. The royal court, now seated in Rio de Janeiro, became a hub of cultural and intellectual activity. This newfound vibrancy was instrumental in fueling the flames of rebellion against the Portuguese rule. A key figure who emerged during this period was Dom Pedro I, the Prince Regent of Brazil. He chose to stay in Brazil, defying orders to return to Portugal, and in September of 1822, he declared Brazil's independence. Thus, Brazil embarked on a new journey, leaving its colonial past behind and stepping into the future as an independent nation. From indigenous tribes to European discovery, from colonial exploitation to the fight for independence, we've journeyed through the rich tapestry of Brazil's origins. We've seen the First Nations thrive, witnessed the arrival of the Europeans, experienced the trials of colonial times, and felt the pulse of the struggle for independence. Each stage pivotal, crafting the vibrant, diverse Brazil we know today. And that, my friends, is a snapshot of the fascinating origins of Brazil. Until next time, keep exploring the pages of history.